This is going to sound strange, but bear with me. When I was in high school, there was a kid who told everyone he was a demon. I don't feel comfortable even writing his real name, for reasons you'll understand in a moment. So, for now, let's just call him Chris. Despite his Shakespearean-sounding name, Chris was extremely socially awkward. He had a vacant stare that made even the teachers uncomfortable. He wore the same blank gray hoodie every single day, no exaggeration. I'm pretty sure he never washed it, given how awful he smelled. Chris was fairly short and average-looking, but you wouldn't be able to tell because he always had his hood up and never took off his sunglasses, even indoors. Teachers eventually gave up asking him to remove them because he never listened anyway. Now, here's where things get weird. Chris had no friends, but had this strange habit of adopting people. What I mean by that is, if he liked you, which could happen randomly, he would walk up to you and declare, "You're adopted," meaning you were now a part of his circle. Apparently, this meant you were safe from him, or so he said. He didn't like many people, so very few of us were ever adopted. I was one of the lucky ones, or unlucky ones, depending on how you look at it. Looking back, I think he might have had a crush on me. None of us really believed his demon claims. We all just assumed he was a troubled kid, which he definitely was. Oh, I should mention this all took place in Oak Ridge, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. A girl I used to be friends with, Sophie, was also adopted by him. Chris's crush on her was a bit more obvious, and all of us could tell. One day, my friends and I were hanging out in the dugouts behind our high school, killing time. It was me, Sophie, Emily, and Ben. I can't remember exactly how it happened, but somehow the conversation turned to Chris's crush on Sophie. We all laughed about it, and Sophie was pretty embarrassed. I can't recall the exact nickname we used for Chris, but it was something we'd substitute for his real name because it sounded too clunky. This time, though, I distinctly remember Emily using Chris's real name. The third time she said it, I swear on my life, Chris appeared out of nowhere. He jumped on top of the dugout with a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't scary in the traditional sense, but it was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen. We immediately stopped talking, nervous that he might have overheard us. He didn't say anything, just stared at us. I waved at him, and he nodded back at me before jumping down and walking away. Once we were sure he was gone, we burst into nervous laughter, finding humor in how bizarre the whole situation was. But on the inside, I was still disturbed. The next incident I remember was even creepier and harder to laugh off. I was at Emily's house, just the two of us, hanging out in her room. Her parents were home. I'm not sure what we were talking about, but again, Chris's name came up 3 times. Less than 10 minutes later, we heard Emily's front door slam shut. Confused, we went downstairs to see if one of our other friends had arrived. Emily's mom had already beaten us to the door, and as we turned the corner into the living room, we were shocked to see Chris standing there, talking to Emily's mom. She asked him what he was doing there, and he just replied, "I was summoned." Emily's mom made some small talk before politely asking him to leave, which he did, silently. Emily and I were pretty shaken by the whole thing, though. As we went back upstairs, we talked in whispers about how creepy it all was. It didn't take long for us to connect the dots. Chris seemed to show up whenever his name was said 3 times. I know it sounds ridiculous, but we had both witnessed 2 unexplainable events. and considering Chris's history of claiming to be a demon, how else could we explain what had happened? We told all our friends the next day, and we made a pact to never say Chris's name 3 times in one conversation again. A few months passed, and I started thinking maybe I had overreacted. That is, until one day when we were at my friend Johnny's house. The same group of us, me, Sophie, Emily, and Ben, were hanging out on Johnny's back deck. Somehow, the topic of Chris came up again. Despite all our warnings, Johnny refused to believe our stories. Even after confirming it with everyone, he was still skeptical. To prove us wrong, he jokingly used Chris's name 3 times in one sentence.
To our horror, nothing happened. At first. Then, just a few minutes later, Chris appeared by jumping over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny noticed him first and stopped mid-sentence. The rest of us followed suit, going silent, not sure what to expect. Chris stared at us for a few moments before jumping back over the fence and disappearing. Johnny started freaking out, accusing us of conspiring with Chris to scare him. We assured him we hadn't said anything, but he was so shaken up, he eventually told us to go home. Clearly, he was disturbed by what had just happened. The last encounter I had with Chris was the most frightening, and it's the only time I genuinely felt my life might have been in danger. A few months after the incident at Johnny's house, I was home alone one night. My parents were rarely gone, but this was one of those rare occasions. I invited a guy I had been talking to over. He was kind of a jerk, but then again, so were most of the guys I knew at that age. We were hanging out in my room when he mentioned Chris. I cringed, and when he asked why, I explained everything to him. He laughed and said he was going to say Chris's name to mess with me. I begged him not to, but he did it anyway. This time, he didn't just say it. He screamed Chris's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. The moment he finished yelling, the rain outside picked up. A flash of lightning followed shortly after. I started to panic. The guy seemed sorry and said it was just a crazy coincidence. I didn't care, though. I ran to my window to look at the storm. Then I saw it. A silhouette of a person standing at the end of my driveway, looking up at my window. The storm made it hard to see clearly, but I was almost certain it was Chris. I quickly shut the blinds and rushed downstairs to check that all the doors were locked. But when I looked out again, the person was still standing there, motionless, in my front yard. Panic set in. I started screaming, "I'm adopted," over and over again, not knowing what else to do. The guy I was with rushed downstairs and tried to comfort me, but I was in full panic mode. I looked out again, and the figure was gone. The storm was still raging outside, but I wasn't going to go search the property. The next morning, after the guy left, I went to check the yard. To my horror, I found something sinister in the far corner of my backyard. Chris's hoodie, and inside it, some random belongings of mine that I thought I'd lost. My parents weren't home, and I was too terrified to call the police. I decided I'd show them what I found when they came back. But when I went to school the next day, Chris didn't show up. He didn't come the day after that either, and we never saw him again. No one knew what happened to him. My parents still live in that house, and I think about Chris sometimes. Some people from school told me they'd seen him hiding and eavesdropping on their conversations, which might explain how he always seemed to show up out of nowhere. As I've gotten older and thought back on the whole thing, I realized that Chris was probably just a mentally ill stalker who followed me and possibly other girls around. He could have been listening to our conversations, which makes me shudder. I don't even want to know where he is now. A few years ago, my friend Mike and I were on our way to a dinner party in Denver on a snowy Saturday evening. Before we got to the party, we decided to stop at a liquor store. The snow made it annoying, but we didn't want to show up without anything. We picked out some local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey, then headed back to the car. I remember the snow starting to come down heavier, but it wasn't anything we couldn't handle. Mike went back into the store to grab a pack of Zins, his new nicotine habit. I was a little annoyed because I was the one driving, and the snow made it hard. Plus, my car wasn't great for this kind of weather. After a few minutes, Mike came back, and we got in the car. I pulled out of the parking lot, and we started driving. The snow was coming down even harder now, covering the roads. Our drive was supposed to be easy, just about 20 to 30 minutes, through familiar neighborhoods. But of course, things never go as planned. The snowstorm turned what should have been a simple drive into something dangerous. I'm not the best driver, and the car kept slipping every few seconds, making it worse. After a few tense minutes, I turned a corner and saw something I never expected. A car in the middle of the street, with its hazards flashing. Both doors were open. I thought about just driving around it and continuing, but Mike told me to stop. Normally, I don't trust strangers, and I usually keep to myself, but Mike convinced me to stop. We sat there for a few seconds in silence. Mike asked if we should check it out, and I said, yes, we are. But I really didn't want to get out of the car. I told Mike to wait a few more minutes, and he reluctantly agreed. We sat there, watching the flashing lights against the snowy backdrop. Nothing happened for a while, and I was surprised. Eventually, Mike got tired of waiting and said he was going to check it out. Before I could stop him, he jumped out of the car. As he walked towards the vehicle, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It could have just been my nerves, but the whole situation felt worse by the second. A few seconds later, I saw the car jolt, like something had moved inside. Maybe I was just imagining it, but I didn't want to take any chances. I hit the horn, scaring Mike, who quickly ran back to the car. I drove off right away and told him my suspicion. It was a trap. Mike didn't believe me at first, but I wasn't going to risk it. The rest of the drive was tense. Mike wasn't happy with me, and I didn't blame him. We finally made it to the dinner party, and everything seemed normal again. After a few hours of catching up, our host turned on the TV to show the latest news about the snowstorm. That's when we heard the story. The police were talking about a car that had been stolen earlier that evening. The victim, a woman, was driving with her son when they saw a car in the road with its doors open and hazards on. When they went to check, two men jumped out and one came out of the trunk. They robbed the woman at gunpoint and stole both cars. I looked at Mike in shock. That could have been us. We told everyone at the party what had happened earlier, and it made the atmosphere pretty serious. People were shocked, but also curious. I realized that experience made me even more distrustful of strangers than before. Now, I wonder how many people I might have helped if I hadn't been so scared. This happened when I was about 10 years old, over 30 years ago. My family was huge, and at that age, I didn't even know all my relatives. My dad had 8 siblings, so there were a lot of aunts, uncles, and cousins. My grandparents had a big beach house, and our whole family would spend a lot of time there in the summer. I had a favorite uncle, Uncle Joseph. He was the dad of my cousin Brandon. Brandon wasn't very social, but I really liked Uncle Joseph. He was always kind, made me laugh, and he was also a therapist. I would often talk to him about things I didn't feel comfortable telling my parents. One summer, I started having very disturbing nightmares. They didn't have any clear pattern, just scary dreams about family members dying or being alone. But one dream stood out. It was a false awakening, where I woke up, went downstairs, but no one was there. I checked all the rooms, but my family was gone. I ended up crying in my room, feeling abandoned. After having a few more nightmares like this, I told Uncle Joseph. He listened carefully, wrote down notes, and then told me I needed to do some thinking about why I was having these dreams. He said something was bothering me in my mind. I was confused because I was just a kid, and I didn't think I was mad at anyone. A few days later, I told Uncle Joseph the nightmares hadn't stopped. He said that I was frustrated with my parents and had some hidden anger. That confused me even more because I loved my parents. But Uncle Joseph was a therapist, so I trusted him. He told me to try being a bit more disobedient, to say no more often, and to argue with my parents. I didn't like it, but I did it for 3 days. It felt awful, and my parents started to get worried. But the nightmares got worse, more disturbing. I couldn't take it anymore, so I went back to Uncle Joseph. He said there was one more thing we could try. He said my mind was too mature for my young body and that I needed to set it free. I didn't understand what he meant, but I was desperate. That night, I didn't have a nightmare, but I woke up, too scared to move. I stayed completely still, when suddenly, I heard a whisper, right next to my ear. It was Uncle Joseph's voice. I turned and screamed, and he quickly left the room. I ran to my parents' room and told them everything. My dad went straight to Uncle Joseph's room. There was a fight, and my dad found a bag with lots of disturbing notes and articles about dreams and nightmares. It was all about making people have nightmares on purpose. It was terrifying. Uncle Joseph was arrested, and I never saw him again. My parents never talked about it, but I know now that he was doing something horrible. Sometimes I wonder how I didn't see the signs earlier, but there's nothing I can do about it now.